Welcome to True Bill Talk, a podcast about the realities of being a prosecutor, challenges in the field, and how we can make our criminal justice system work better for everyone. My name is Alyssa Marquederi, and I'm the director of the Vanderbilt Project on Prosecution Policy, also known as VPOP, here at Vanderbilt Law School. Most prosecutors, especially those who don't handle appeals, they'll tell you that their work typically starts with an investigation or an arrest, and it ends with sentencing. For them, and for me when I still worked at the DA's office, once a defendant was sentenced, a prosecutor's work was considered complete. It sometimes feels like an assembly line. You start a case, you work on it, you finish it, and move on to the next one. But just because a case ends doesn't mean that it's the end of its impact. It's actually far from it. The lives of people that the crime and a case touched, victims, their families, the convicted people, those lives continue and are now forever altered. Victims face the overwhelming journey of trying to heal. Their friends and family have to also find a way to support them as the victim works through a lot of trauma. And at the same time, the person who's sent to prison and their loved ones, they have to come to terms with being apart, often for a long time. And that's especially hard during big milestones, holidays, and birthdays. The truth is, this essential human aspect of what happens after sentencing often gets totally overlooked in how we think about the role of the prosecutor. Because prosecution really is, like I said, an assembly line, once a plea is secured or a conviction is reached and the defendant is taken away, the prosecutor usually moves on. And for the most part, they don't have to think about all of these after effects of a case. Today, we're going to talk about a growing movement that is actually encouraging prosecutors to rethink their role and be more engaged in this post-sentencing phase. It's a movement to introduce and pass laws called prosecutor-initiated resentencing laws, which empower prosecutors to petition for a reevaluation of sentences. So, for example, you might have a defendant sentenced to, say, 20 years for a burglary. Prosecutor-initiated resentencing laws allow that prosecutor, 10 years later, to ask a court to reduce that defendant's sentence to, say, 10 years, and therefore allow him or her to reunite with their family. They still have a criminal conviction on their record, but they serve much less time than originally planned. A few states, starting with California and now other places like Illinois and Minnesota, have passed these laws. Leading this initiative is an organization called For the People, founded by today's guest, Hillary Blout. When I first learned about For the People's work, I had a lot of questions, like how has this law affected prosecutors' offices? Are they overwhelmed with requests from defendants seeking resentencing? And how do Hillary and her team address concerns from victims and communities who may feel bothered by the possibility of shortened sentences at the discretion of current DAs? I loved hearing Hillary answer these hard questions during our interview, and she also shared a lot about her personal background, which really informs her current work in an interesting way. I hope you enjoy the episode. Tell us a little bit about where you grew up, your childhood, anything about your family that you're willing to share.
Sure. So I grew up in California. I grew up in a neighborhood in the Bay Area, in the east side of the Bay Area called Pittsburgh, California, and kind of toggled between the Bay Area in Pittsburgh and then my grandparents in Monterey area. My grandpa was in the military, and my grandma's Japanese, and so that environment was very, stable and orderly and safe. And then
is this mom's side or dad's side?
Mom's side. Okay. Mom's side. Dad's not around. And so on mom's side, and so then back in Pittsburgh, we lived in a neighborhood that had a lot of crime and violence. And so, it, kind of saw it really transform and become a lot more violent in the years that I had lived there, a lot of drug trafficking. So I grew up in that environment and I felt really lucky to get out of that environment, and education was really my ticket out. And so so that's how I grew up. And I think the stability of having the grandparents and the very safe and orderly and kind of structured environment was really critical for me to have kind of the stability and feel like I had a family that was rooting for me and encouraging me to, go to college. And so that's how I grew up.
And you mentioned your dad wasn't really in the picture, and your mom's parents are in Monterey. So just curious, why were you in Pittsburgh at all? Because it's not like you're shuffling between two parents' homes.
Right. Yeah. So my mom decided she wanted to make it on her own. She didn't want to have to be, getting not handouts, but my grandparents were very involved in helping to raise me. And my mom wanted to go to the Bay Area, to make it on her own. And she had a job offer to be out here. Okay. And I had some friends out here. And so she decided that this is where she was going to, make it. And that's what led us out here. But where she could afford during that time was just an environment that wasn't very safe.
And so at some point, did you move to Monterey full time? Or were you really going?
No, she was always committed to making it on her own. And so we stayed in the Bay Area for all of my childhood.
And so when were you going to Monterey to the safer?
We would go almost every weekend. I would be there all summer, all the holidays, Christmas. So I spent a lot of time there, but our home base was in the area.
And what was that like? Just having two wildly different environments throughout your childhood. I don't know. I mean, I have to think that impacts your decision, your career path in some way.
Yeah. I think in looking back, it makes a lot of sense because I've always toggled between two, being mixed race. It's like, are you Black? Are you Puerto Rican? What are you? Right. That was always the big joke. It's like I'm Black and Japanese.
Yeah, I was going to say, you're not Puerto Rican at all, right?
No, okay. I'm not. That was what I would just say when I was younger. I think a lot of, people when they're mixed, they just try to say that they're one race to just help people make sense.
Yeah.
And so toggling between those worlds, it sort of has been how my life has been, moving forward as well. Like I ran around with a group of, good kids that had my back, but had less structure and less resources than I did. And so they definitely dabbled into things and didn't have as much of a focus on, going to school and getting out. And so I had that kind of world. And then when I ended up graduating from high school, most of the friends that I started out with in high school didn't end up graduating. Then I went off to junior college, and a lot of the people that I went to junior college with didn't end up leaving junior college. So I think that I'm grateful, as I mentioned, when I think about, especially the work that I do now, when I look at and I understand people's story about the environment that they were in mm-hmm. and what was stacked against them. I mean, I was in a similar environment. I was exposed to a lot. I saw a lot of violence. I had friends that were murdered in really brutal ways. But I had a mom that was very focused on me and very focused on my success and very present. And then I had this very stable grandparent environment that was just a reminder of how many people were expecting me to do good mm-hmm. and expecting me to be productive. And I very much understood my grandfather's struggle coming from the South and how hard he worked to create something for his children and then his grandchildren. So I know that those kinds of things were instrumental in making sure that I did end up getting out of the environment that I was in and going off to try to make something of myself, right? Having self-worth that I could be something. And all of that came from the love that I received from my family.
So where you grew up half the time, Pittsburgh, what is that? What is that town or city like? I mean, is it an urban area? What are the demographics like? Are the kids who you grew up with, were they mostly Black? Was it really diverse?
Pittsburgh is pretty diverse. It's working class. It's pretty diverse. I don't know what the racial composition is, but in the part of the community that I grew up, it was predominantly Black. And unfortunately, the street that I lived on became what's called a dope track. So it just happened to be that where we were living, a couple houses near us became the spot for transporting and selling drugs in our neighborhood. So there was just a lot of foot traffic of people purchasing drugs, on drugs, shootouts, chasing, cops, yellow tape.
So you really saw it all as a kid.
I really saw it all. And, not a lot of lighting, not a lot of street lights, limited transportation to get over there. We didn't have a BART train that went all the way out there when I was living there. And so, what was once, I think, just a affordable place or low income kind of community, when you layered on top of that drug activity, and then that street, I lived on a street called Nautilus, so if there was any police officer from Contra Costa County in the 90s listening to this, they would say, oh, yes, we all know Nautilus and Trident. We know that street well.
Right.
That's where I lived.
So how do you land up in prosecution? I mean, obviously it's a huge jump from your childhood but I don't know if you always knew you were going to be a lawyer. So tell us a little bit about that path.
My childhood friends that I'm friends with today reminded me that I said this when I was in high school. I'm going to be a lawyer one day. I don't know if I saw it on a show, and so I thought that's what I want to be, or I chose something that was the furthest from what was possible given the community of people that I was around. That feels like something I would do. I'm gonna anchor myself to something that is unattainable, shoot for the moon and then maybe I'll hit a star, kind of a thing. But it was a meandering path. Certainly it took a long time to get through junior college, and had a lot of experiences along the way that woke me up to getting focused and serious and trying to get out of the environment that I was in. And then when I finally went to college, I was really interested in political science. I didn't really think about being a prosecutor. I didn't really think that people with the background that I had, or the community that I came from, or the friends that I ran around with would be suitable to becoming a prosecutor. And So I did initially think that where I was supposed to go, quote unquote, was to become a public defender. And so that was the path that I was on when I went to law school. And then when I went one day, when I was doing an externship with a judge, and I was about to watch my very first trial, when the lawyers walked in, and one was African-American and one was a white man. And when the African-American guy comes in and sets his stuff up, I immediately wondered why he was at the wrong table, because that's not where defense attorneys go. They don't set their things up next to the jury box. That's where the prosecutors go. So I was very confused about, this court must have been setting it up differently. Okay. And but I didn't think anything of it. I was like, okay, they're doing it a little bit different. And then when he introduced himself, I was
as the prosecutor,
for the people. I'm like, what is happening? So he and I went up to him and I asked him, like, what are you doing being a prosecutor? And, you're Black and you shouldn't be doing this. And it was, kind of, as many young law students are, right? They know it all and they're going to, fight the system. And so we had this conversation and he explained to me where he was from, that he was also from the South and deep roots in the South, and that he took this position because he believed that there was more good that he can do from the position of being a prosecutor. And that concept really opened things up. And I cared very much about safe communities. I hated walking home from school on the bus, and especially if it was dusk. I felt very unsafe. I hated that feeling. I didn't like the feeling of knowing that somebody broke into our house. And so, and I had experienced and seen a lot of violence, a lot of domestic violence in my community. So, ideas of working with victims and supporting victims and doing things that can make communities safer really struck me, and that I would be able to know that every case that I worked on, every defendant that I was handling, that I would do it with care and I would be thoughtful and I would not be retributive, but I would make sure that that the outcome was as fair as possible. And I could ensure that that I would be able to do that. And that was the concept that I had in my mind. So that was the opening. And then I went to work with him and shadow him and watch how he moved, and let me to see if he's really about what he says he's about. And
which,
he was.
Which office was he with?
This was in San Francisco.
So San Francisco DA's office.
Right. And I watched him and I analyzed him, and I was definitely skeptical, about, was he really going to be this amazing, fair prosecutor? Does that even go together, kind of a thing? And he was. And I was really impressed with the lack of ego and the amount of integrity that he showed in every time he walked into the courtroom, every time he spoke to the family member of either the victim or the defendant's family who wanted to yell at him and tell him about himself. And so I really was inspired by him and seeing what was possible. And so that was how it all started.
So you shadow this Black prosecutor who you're skeptical of, but kind of wins you over. And then do you go straight to the DA's office after law school?
So at the end of the externship, at the time, Kamala Harris was the district attorney, and I was also very impressed with her, her perspective on the role of the prosecutor, talking about, being smart on crime versus tough on crime, and explaining her philosophy that for so many people that enter the justice system, there can be all these off-ramps. Not everybody needs to go right into behind bars. There could be all these off ramps if we offered job training programs, workforce. And so that was also happening at that time. And it was very much perceived as a little bit crazy, a little bit out there, a little San Francisco for sure. But I saw it and I believed in it. So the Back on Track program, instead of having, giving opportunities to people who are dealing drugs to be in another kind of economy, right? Programs for women who were in the underground street economy and sex workers, that there could also be programs for off ramps for them. But at the end of it, I still, in my mind, did not think that with my background and where I grew up and likely knowing defendants that could potentially be coming in and out of the courtroom in San Francisco, that it wasn't really suited for me. Now, my mentor, he was Black, so I was like, okay, so apparently Black people do this job, and Kamala is Black also. But I still wasn't clear that my background was the right fit. And so at the end of the externship, or the internship, excuse me, at the end of the internship, Kamala would talk to interns and, kind of give them a little bit of FaceTime, thank them for doing the internship. And so she did that with me and then asked me why I wanted to be a prosecutor. And I said, I don't think I want to be a prosecutor, but this was a good experience. I I'm going to be a public defender because that's really where I'm supposed to go, given my history and background. And then she, of course, probes, what do you mean? What kind of background? And I said, well, this is where I grew up and I might know some defendants and, I don't think this is where I fit. And then she asked me, do I care about, safe communities? Have I ever experienced living in a community that wasn't safe? And I said, well, yes. And have I ever been around anybody who's been a victim of crime? And have I ever tried to help them? And I said, well, yes. And she said, well, you're exactly what we're looking for. Tells me about her background and where she grew up and why she chose this career path. I at that time already had a law firm job, which felt impossible to get. I mean, even going to law school, my family tried to convince me that it might not be a good path for me because I wasn't very academic in school. I barely graduated high school. Took 7 years to get my bachelor's. I spent a lot of time in junior college. So my family tried to convince me, it's a lot of reading and it's a lot of homework and you don't like reading and you don't like homework.
So this conversation with Kamala Harris is going into is this the summer before your third year?
This is the summer. This is my third year. This is during my third year of law school. And I had managed to do pretty well in my first year. I landed myself a summer associate position at a law firm and then got an offer to work at the law firm when I graduated. So that was the path I was on. And that's what I told her. I appreciate all that you're saying, but I have a law firm job and there's no way I'm giving that up. Right. And so I went off and worked at the law firm and I lasted for 7 months.
I thought you were going to say days.
No, I lasted for 7 months.
Not because of your background, but your academics, but just, I also don't think I would last more than 7 days.
Yeah. I worked 7 days a week, except for on Sundays, I got off at 4. And that was, it was soul crushing, soulless, made really good money, but it just didn't compensate for how empty it felt and how alive I felt when I was at the DA's office. And so I applied and then went on to work at the DA's office in San Francisco.
So I do want to get to prosecutor-initiated resentencing, but I love this background stuff because I think it's really important. And so tell us sort of how you go from the DA's office to for the people, and then we'll get into the substance of prosecutor-initiated resentencing. Right.
Yeah, so I worked at the DA's office, and I found a lot of purpose while I was there. I was very focused on a career trajectory of working with crimes against women and children. I really wanted to do that work. I candidly didn't want to do as much work around gangs and drugs, and just based on where I grew up and the kids that I was around. And I understood why they ended up where they ended up and didn't see that the criminal justice system really took that into consideration. By the time you've committed a serious crime, that's what the focus is. And I just didn't want to be in the position of having to hold those folks accountable because I knew it would be prison time. So I kind of in my mind thought I'm going to just go through the assignments that I need to, and then I can get to doing this work with protecting women and children. But obviously you don't get to just pick and choose. And so I did rotations where I had to handle some of those kinds of cases, and I had to send people to prison, right. And I think what happened along the way is I got a little hardened. I did. I remember when I began, I was going to write every defendant's name on a piece of paper and then put it in this box, and I would pray for them and hope for them. And so if I did have to hold them accountable, I would also be hoping for their rehabilitation. And I did that a little bit, and then that fell off, right? Because again, like that that was a 7-day-a-week job as well. I mean, it was crushing in terms of volume.
Yeah.
And so I did that for a couple of years, and I did end up getting into working on cases that were domestic violence cases. And I just kept moving up the ranks, and the charges became more serious. The exposure became life. The injuries were, permanent for some of the women's cases that I was working with. And I started to, what felt like I could really focus my, I guess, anger towards the harm that they had caused at the defendants. And really it felt very clear that I was protecting these women and pointing at the defendant, and that was the bad person, and the jury needs to hold them accountable. And as I started reading the histories, because I would prepare for the defense attorney to come in and talk about the defendant's childhood, right? I needed to know about what they were going to try to pull in to get the juries to sympathize. I started reading it, and I just started feeling like so many of these defendants were victims themselves. And it was getting more and more, I thought it was getting more challenging for me to, quote, do my job, which was to go hard on these defendants and try to get the most convictions I could and the longest sentence possible. I was getting harder for me to do that. It was starting to get very blurry, and I was starting to feel bad for them. And, their family members would come in and they'd be sobbing, and I'd have to really try to look away because I just kept feeling like, am I doing the right thing? Is this the right outcome? So I started having those questions, and then I took a break. Thought I was going to just take a short break and I was going to go back. I had 2 kids at the time, barely saw them. And so I was going to go and just be with my kids for a little bit, get the youngest one into kindergarten, and then I was going to go back. And then on that break, a colleague of mine was working on a ballot initiative in California that was looking at the justice system and questioning a bit around, like, are these types of policies really making us safer? And it was around people who were in prison for low-level offenses. And I didn't know that people were actually getting sent to prison for stealing, a ham sandwich from a grocery store. Mm-hmm. Like, I didn't, that wasn't, we weren't doing that in San Francisco. And so when I started learning about a couple things, one, that how we did things in San Francisco was very different than how things were happening in other parts of the state and the country. 2, that there were people in prison serving for time that just seemed ridiculous and really, really extreme. And that 3, if people were rehabilitated, that it didn't really matter. What mattered was the original sentence that they received, but there wasn't some system where they were just getting out. And I never thought about that. I just assumed, if I'm in court and I'm asking for 10, 15 years prison time and stacking all the things and all the enhancements, that if in 10 years that person is different, there's some other mechanism that's going to work itself out, and that person's going to get out and they're going to go back home. They're not just going to stay for another 10 years because I was outsmarted the defense attorney. Right. Or I had better evidence, or the judge was more compelled with my arguments than the defense attorney. So I learned those things, and that is what really got me very academic. I became very academic. I started reading. I started going into prisons. I started talking to other advocates and just learning about how the system operates outside of what I understood when I was working as a DA.
And this is during your break. So you're not working at all at this time officially, right? You're taking care of your 2 kids at home, and then in your spare time, which I don't know how you do that. If you're
I'm doing some consulting. I'm doing a little bit of consulting. I'm working maybe, 10, 15 hours a week at most, just doing some consulting. And the job that I had was to find like-minded people from law enforcement that agreed that there's people in prison serving for low-level offenses that shouldn't be there, and that the policies that we have in place are not always leading us to safety. And what are some of those policies, and what are some of those opinions? And is there anybody out there in law enforcement that's having these same kinds of questions, right? And so that was what my job was.
So I'm going to assume you don't go back to the DA's office as you had originally planned.
At that time, I still talked to all of my colleagues, all of my former colleagues who loved me, and I loved them. I mean, it was my deepest friendships came from working in that office, and they thought I was crazy because of the questions I was asking, but they were also curious. Well, what did you learn what did you learn about that? And so that was also interesting for me, that because they knew I was down, because they were in the trenches, I was in the trenches with them. They knew I was a real in the trenches, prosecuting cases, sending people to prison kind of prosecutor, that I was one of them. And so they trusted what I said when I told them, here's what I've learned, here's what I've seen. So I didn't at that time feel like I'm never going back. I just felt like I had more to learn and uncover in working on these areas of reform, which is also a new word for me. And so I continued doing that. And then it was having these, what I called at the time, these courageous conversations with police chiefs or sheriffs or other prosecutors, like, well, let's talk about that. Well, what do you think about this, and this? And I felt really good about that. And I felt really good about saying, well, I'm a former prosecutor, and how that would change the conversation. Like, oh, okay, well, then you get it. I'm like, yeah, I do get it. So let's see from this position of I don't know, sisterhood, brotherhood, whatever. Like I've walked in your shoes before, how the conversation, or how I could push the conversation from that point. And I found a lot of openness and receptivity to, I'm not here to attack you, because I'm not attacking myself, right? I'm not saying that what you did is bad, because I may go back to be a DA myself. What I'm saying is, do you think it's fair that these people are still in prison? And it's like, well, no, I don't think it. So these kind of courageous conversations were happening. And then I decided at that time, when I was in this space with all of these, advocates and activists and defense attorneys that were all talking about reform, I was really the lone prosecutor. There was no other prosecutors in this space, former prosecutors in this space at all. And there was a lot of disparaging comments about prosecutors, a lot of, they're the devil. I mean, multiple people told me I was Satan. Oh, you did Satan's work before? I mean, like literal conversations. Oh, you're okay now, even though you did Satan's work. And I just was like, that's not really what we were doing, right? And so it became really important to me, again, back in this, like, not, when I was at the DA's office, I was definitely minimizing or not sharing my background and my childhood and who I ran around with and where they are today. And then when I go to this other world where I'm working with activists and advocates, I'm very, in the beginning, very much minimizing that I was a former prosecutor. And when it comes up, I'm being attacked and having to sit there and listen to them talk about how evil prosecutors are, just like when I was a prosecutor, listening to my colleagues talk about these terrible people. And I'm thinking, well, that guy feels just like the kid I grew up with, who wasn't a terrible person and just had a really terrible upbringing. But that conversation also didn't really have a lot of room in that environment. So I think at that point, I just was, kind of tired of having to apologize, I think, for what it meant to be a prosecutor. And then I was like, I really believe that there's other prosecutors that think the way that I do, that feel the way that I do. We just have to find them and organize them. And so that's really what I set out to do. And I had a couple different opportunities to learn from some prosecutors that ran on reform agendas, and that was great. But even in that world, it felt very much, again, an us versus them approach. It was, here's the good prosecutors that check all the boxes for how they're going to change the system, and if you don't hit all of these boxes, then you're not one of us, right? And this was, really more, I think, more kind of philanthropy and, kind of a movement that a lot of, quote, progressive prosecutors, I think, got caught up in, that they didn't really ever ask for the title or the targets on their back. But at that time, as that was beginning, I didn't really fit in with that either, because it felt like we're doing another one of those, you're good or you're bad, or you're in or you're out, or you're with us or you're against us. And I just had spent so much time going back and forth. It was giving me, whiplash from, am I in this side? Am I in this side? And what I wanted to do, I wanted to create something that could rise above those types of politics and sort of binary thinking, and have something that was really a big tent. And it was just, if there's anybody out there that's a prosecutor that feels like there's people in prison that maybe don't need to be there, or they've changed and you're interested to know how they've changed and you want to be involved in that, then let's work together. And we can disagree on death penalty, and we can disagree on lots of things. That's fine. But if we could agree on this, then that was the place that I wanted to create.
And then the legislation in California was born.
And then the idea was, I'm going to work with prosecutors because they don't have the bandwidth, they don't have the education, right? I had just spent several years educating myself about what was happening behind the prison walls and how many people were there that were serving sentences that, in today's terms, are really excessive, or they've rehabilitated. The idea was, I'm gonna work on a project to help find those folks and then connect them with prosecutors, and then prosecutors could use the power that they already have to get them out of prison. And so I didn't know then that they didn't have that power. I just assumed that power was there. So when I learned that there was no actual mechanism, even if the prosecutor was completely on board and wanted to get the person out, there was no mechanism. And there was a case out of Santa Clara County, which was exactly this scenario. It was a man named Arnolfo, and he worked at the San Quentin News. And by all accounts, he just did not need to be in prison anymore. And the Santa Clara DA's office was trying to figure out a way to get him out, but there was no error. There was no conviction issues. And they had to kind of do this legal sort of workaround. It took a really long time because there was no law that said, in the interest of justice. And so that was the law that I wrote. And I wrote it and worked with that county, with the DA from Santa Clara County, who had that experience of, if I had a law, I would have been able to have done this work more quickly. And I would use it for instances of learning that there's somebody in prison that's serving a sentence that, under today's standards, I don't believe should stand. So that's what we did together. We worked on this legislation and we got it passed, and then it went into effect in 2019.
And how hard was it to get it passed?
Interestingly enough, it was not that challenging. I talked to, again, with this concept of Big Tent, the first person I talked to was an elected prosecutor in Sacramento. She was the most conservative prosecutor in the state of California. And I went right to her and I asked her what she thought. And she thought she liked the fact that it gave prosecutors a discretion. Right. They weren't being told what to do. They could use it or not. And they could decide, after talking to the victim, how they wanted to proceed. And those elements I think were very compelling for her. And after that, with her on board, I was able to get a couple other key offices in support. And then I remember going to the legislature and working on this law. And usually you have the law enforcement lobby shows up and they all come and they oppose. And I remember that they showed up as if they were supposed to oppose, but it was a law that gave DAs power. So they didn't oppose that. But the power was to get people out of prison. So they thought that that was something that they should be opposing. But they showed up and then noticed that other people weren't opposing. And then they decided that they didn't have opposition if the DAs were supportive of it.
Did you have the formal support of the DAs Association of the state?
We didn't have, they didn't support it, but they were neutral. So we had no opposition.
Wow.
There was no opposition.
But so just because I kind of jumped the gun. So just to summarize, so prosecutor-initiated resentencing broadly is legislation that explicitly gives prosecutors the power to resentence somebody who's already been convicted and sentenced, right, to a shorter period of time. Is that basically the accurate summary?
That's right.
And so it first passes in California, and since then, where else has this been passed? My understanding is with your leadership.
And so the law has been passed. We were contacted by both Washington State and Oregon that they were interested in working on a similar law. So folks there had already begun the work, and we came to provide testimony about how it's working in California. So it went into effect in Oregon and Washington, and then shortly thereafter, we worked on a law and supported this passage in Illinois. And then in Minnesota, we worked for about 3 years trying to get the law passed there, and that went into effect last year. And then just this year, Utah passed enacted a rule change that allows prosecutors to make recommendations around people who deserve shorter sentences.
Have there been situations where victims oppose the resentencing, but the prosecutor goes ahead anyway? And I assume that's legal under the law. It's purely at the discretion of the DA.
It's legal under the law. It's similar to how things are on the front end, right, where the victim's voice is critical, but it's not determinative of what the outcome will be. There have been some instances, I will say, that the majority of DAs that are using this law typically don't move forward if the victim is opposed. Mm-hmm. And many of them won't even consider reopening it if they believe that just the phone call itself would be re-traumatizing. So a lot of cases don't move forward at that stage before a victim is even contacted. Okay.
So you started an organization called For the People shortly after you passed the law in California. Mm-hmm. And so you've been doing this work since 2019?
Yes.
With For the People. So what states is For the People focusing on now in terms of passing this legislation?
So we worked on a law in Texas, and there's a representative there. Representative Cook was very interested in having this law for the state. It passed the House. It didn't pass the Senate. There's still a lot of questions from prosecutors around how this law would be implemented, the resources that would be required to do this work. There's still concerns around victims and truth in sentencing and finality. And so it takes some time for us to help to explain why those issues haven't been issues really in California. So we're continuing to just have a presence on how the law works and just continue to drive those conversations further. But we're focused on Texas. We're focused on states in the South that would be interested in having this law. The prison populations in some of the southern states are fairly high with with high incarceration rates and racial disparity. And so that's really been a focus for us. And it's also a focus because the ultimate goal, granted, it's like I'm from San Francisco and I'm from California, and so that has a certain reputation across the country, as if we're just kind of out here doing crazy things. And we really, our hope is that this is something that prosecutors across all political and geographies will embrace, and really see this as something that's just, it's a good practice, and that bringing concepts of humanity and mercy and redemption into the justice system shouldn't feel like scary things. But I do think that it's gonna take some time, because those are concepts that hadn't really and don't really exist in many prosecutor offices. And I understand why, right? I understand intimately that when you have a volume of cases, a truly crushing caseload, all you can do is, do the main thing, right? And the main thing is you get a case, you figure out what you can prove, you figure out based on what you can prove how strong the case is. How strong the case is what gets you to what you're going to offer to settle it. If you can't reach that, you go to trial, and then you move to the next. And if you start to feel and care and consider and all, it gets very complicated, and it gets very hard to do your job, which was my experience when I left the DA's office. I couldn't keep things in these neat little boxes. So I understand that. But what we have seen in California is that, PIR is not a decarceration pathway, right? This is not a measure. It's not part of Cut 50 or any of that. These are not going to yield, hundreds of thousands of people getting out. These are very meticulous. They are time intensive. Some cases we work on can take up to 2 years because we're really focused on supporting the DAs, who are very focused in getting it right. Mm-hmm. And so I think when southern states or states in more conservative places, I guess it's almost like let their guard down and just hear us out in terms of how it's actually working in practice. I think that they will see that it's a valuable tool that they can use if and when one of these kinds of compelling cases comes along.
So let's talk about the arguments or the concerns you often hear about it. I mean, the two big ones I can think of are like the implementation, right? Because you can imagine, like, conviction review units are overwhelmed in terms of applications for wrongful convictions. I can only imagine that if you open the door to people who aren't even contesting their guilt, but just saying my sentence is too long, I mean, that's going to be in some offices, I don't know, hundreds or even thousands of requests. And then let's also talk about finality, which is the big, you and I have talked about this in the past, but sort of, one thing I think about is if you have a community that voted for a DA who, ran on a tough on crime platform, and they get a 30-year sentence on a burglary, and the victim is sort of the community and the victim is counting on that sentence to be carried out. And now 10 years later, it's a new DA, and potentially all of a sudden the DA is saying, well, I actually think 30 years, that was crazy. So I'm just going to say time served, 10 years is enough. So let's talk about the practical implementation and then the finality concern.
Yeah. So practically, there's not really any way around it. It's another work stream amid other pressing work streams, and a feeling that we can't keep up with the work we do have. How could we do a new thing? And so we try to step in that gap. That's the whole purpose of creating. I had no intention of launching an organization and being an executive director or which is really running a business, which they also don't tell you when you start a nonprofit. You're like, oh, it's a nonprofit. It's not. It's a business that you're running. That's where we try to step in. What we've found is that it feels at first like drinking water from a fire hose, just because everything is so new. But the system that we have developed really streamlines this process, and it gives prosecutors a starting point. So we will typically get prison data and show the prosecutors what their prison population looks like and what a cohort could be if you layer on this person has served about 10 years, excluding cases that feel like they will be re-traumatizing to the victims, or it's riskier than what the DA is willing to take on. And sometimes we'll look at people who are in their 60s, they've been in for a really long time, or maybe they were very young, 15, 14 years old when they committed their offense, and now they're adults. So that gives it's a manageable amount of cases to be looking at. And then over time, what we've been able to do in California and some other states as well, we're doing this in Minnesota and in Illinois, is to streamline the process between getting information from the prison that is relevant to what the DAs need to understand to make their decision. And just that alone, it really streamlines the process. And what's interesting is that, while innocence claims are important and need to be looked at and taken seriously, the process of resentencing in the interest of justice, it's actually a far less complex legal argument. It's really, in looking at how they spent their time over the last 10 years, is it clear? And usually it's very clear. Are they rehabilitated and not the person they were? Or looking back 10 years ago at that sentence, if we had the same case and we had the same facts, would we give that person the same sentence today? And if the answer is no, then the DA office wants to right size that sentence. So once you get through the kind of beginnings of setting this process up, it can become very streamlined for offices. And, offices are doing, anywhere from 5 to 20 cases a year. It's not, depending on the size of the office, it really is, like I said, it is a streamlined process.
To me, the beauty of it is that it's totally customizable based on what the DA wants to prioritize. It's not a mandate saying you have to resentence some group of people. It's, first of all, you don't have to use the tool at all, right? It's just available. And then you can limit the volume of the water coming out of the fire hose by saying, I'm only going to look at defendants who've been in for 20 years, or only 60 and up, or only people who've been in for 20 years and were sentenced when they were 15 or whatever. What about the finality part? And I'm sure you get this question all the time.
So we get a lot of questions. We do get questions around finality and truth in sentencing. And the concepts of finality are really for the benefit for the victim, right? It's the idea that they thought that a particular sentence was going to be in place and there would be no changes to that. And there should be truth in whatever the sentence was. As I mentioned, in doing this work, the DAs are engaging the victims. It's not a situation where I think is finality and truth in sentencing are born out of, where a person is sentenced, the victim learns that they're going to get 20 years, let's say, and then all of a sudden they get some notice in the mail saying, just kidding, this person's getting out in a week.
Right.
And it was that process of, there was a law that's changed, and so now the sentence is going to be shorter. So this is actually the opposite of those kinds of instances that the truth in sentencing and concerns around finality are born out of. In these cases, first of all, if the DA believes that it's going to be re-traumatizing, they don't even engage, they don't consider the case, they don't engage the victim, it stops there. If they feel like, given the facts, given how much work the person has done since they've been inside, that they feel confident that they could even approach the victim. The conversation with the victim is so much different than, this is just letting you know what we've decided. This is just letting you know that person's getting out. The conversation is, I'm the prosecutor. I handled your case. I'm not sure if you remember me or not. We wanted to tell you about something that we've been doing in our office. And we want you to know that no decision has been made, but we want to tell you about why we've even considered calling you about this person. What we've learned about this individual is that as a child, this was the experience that he or she had. And that is why, as we understand it, was the driver of committing the crime that he did. And here's what he's been doing since he's been in prison. And this is the family that has been supporting him. And how would you feel about offering him a chance to be reunited with his family and be a contributing member in our communities? We believe that he could be that. How do you feel about it? That is a completely different type of conversation with a victim than what they have experienced. And oftentimes when we talk to DAs who have these conversations with victims, we hear a lot that victims are open. I never knew that. I never knew anything about the defendant. I actually had a lot of questions because, victims, when something happens to them, it's not that we're trying to say that their childhood or what was going on with them at the time of the crime should excuse what they've done, but at least it makes the victim feel like there was some rationale, right? Or, I didn't know he was high on drugs, or I didn't know that his mother had just died, or I didn't know. And they want to hear that, like, the person has been in prison working really hard at changing their behaviors and making amends. And by the way, here's a letter that he wanted to send to you. Here are some of the words that he has for you if you want to hear them. Other times victims will say, well, this person doesn't feel remorseful because I haven't heard from him. And then they explain to the victim, well, the defendant's not allowed to contact you. Right. There's a portal if you want to hear from him. Oh, I didn't know there was a portal. So there's this opportunity for them to get context and maybe even an opportunity to have like real closure, right? Like it's over. Now this person is done and they're healed. And we've had victims say, we wish this person well. Good luck. We hope he does well.
I think some people listening might want to have numbers, context. So, do you know how many people have been released under the legislation, either in California or in all the states that you mentioned? Let's start with those numbers.
Yeah. So there's not a repository that's been set up to capture the numbers from places across the country. We know there's about 60 prosecutor offices that have engaged or are currently engaging in looking back. There are prosecutors in states that have the law. There are some states that have alternative mechanisms. Colorado is one of them, North Carolina, Georgia. So some other states have alternative mechanisms that are much more narrow, but the prosecutors have been using them when they are aware of a case that's compelling or extraordinary. And so from our surveys that we have done over the almost 6 years, about 1,000 people across the country have been resentenced that we're aware of, and almost 500 people out of California that we're aware of.
Wow. So about 1,000 that you know of, right, nationwide. And you know better as well as anyone else, prosecutors are risk averse, right? So I think a big fear is, even if I, as a prosecutor, am totally on board, I totally agree, God forbid I agree to resentence someone and they reoffend, right? I mean, somebody else now, especially if there's a victim, has been hurt. But then also politically, right? You don't want to be that DA who is, slapped on the cover of the Post. So have there been situations where a person reoffends? Does that change sort of how you've approached this work? How have the DAs, the elected DAs, dealt with that politically when it happens?
Luckily, as I mentioned, I think because it's such a meticulous process and because DAs are using this law sparingly, there have been very few instances of people reoffending. We're aware of a handful, and in most of those situations, there were real lessons learned around the lack of structured reentry. So some people had requested to immediately live with family, not go to transitional housing. One prosecutor in particular, as he always mentions, that the decision was the right decision when it was made in terms of the person's sentence being excessive when compared to somebody similarly situated being prosecuted and sentenced today. And by all accounts, he had followed the rules and done everything right when he was incarcerated. And so those two factors together, the DA did what was right at the time. That person was released. It was COVID. It was one thing after another, and fell back into his addiction and ended up getting rearrested. And that was a learning lesson and a turning point, I think, for a lot of prosecutors around how structured the reentry needs to be, and that transitional housing is likely the best the best system to have in place for people that are returning. And so we've seen prosecutors kind of take that view that it was the right choice at the time. And what can we learn to make sure that we're setting people up for success? And irrespective if they really want to, they want to go be at a certain place. But I think many prosecutors are wanting people coming home to have a lot more structure. There's another instance where...
Sorry, but can I ask something? I mean, so what do DAs do with that? I mean, they can't overnight create better transitional housing. And I'm trying to give you the opportunity to listen to any DAs who are really skeptical of this. Again, not skeptical of the idea, but like, how do I cover my butt in this politically delicate situation, right? So like, you can't just create better services overnight. I can't imagine, if you're taking away the lesson that, well, we shouldn't do this anymore because we don't have great reentry services in our communities. And so what do you say to those DAs who are really fearful of this scenario?
There's a lot of expertise around, so we have social workers. Many of the public defender offices have connections to or in-house social workers. And even in states that don't have social workers embedded in public defender offices or social workers and reentry experts, we've seen now even embedded in DA offices. There are a lot of experts around what does this person need to be successful. It doesn't have to be a brick and mortar, all the bells and whistles, transitional housing, but it's more about, we know more now about asking the right questions in terms of what does this person need to be successful, and really leveraging expertise around what are the systems and structures that need to be in place. Maybe they need to be checking back in with the court more regularly. Maybe they need to be on parole a little bit longer. But when this began, there was less understanding about what was needed and more reliance on maybe the person saying what they thought was going to be good for them. And so what we've seen is prosecutors very much leaning in, really leveraging social workers and the courts as well on making sure that whatever the process is, whatever the reentry plan is, that it really checks all of the boxes and everybody has assurances that they've set something up.
So some people might be resentenced to just whatever, the equivalent of time served, you're out. But a lot of people, it sounds like, are being resentenced to probation, or there are strings attached to their release.
Yes,
Okay.
and the DAs are, especially those that have had those instances of people not being successful, their strings attached and they're attaching more strings.
Interesting. Okay.
Just to make sure to balance, because as you said, the decision wasn't, oh no, we're not doing this anymore. The decision was, oh well, we need more structure. We
Right.
need to attach some more requirements. There needs to be more supervision in this transition period. Something that most people don't realize about this work, right? There's a lot of focus on, well, what are the mechanics and what about the resources and what about the risk and how do we do this with the other things and what about the victims? What people sometimes don't realize, and I don't even know if I realized this myself when I started doing this work, is that we stay in contact with the people that we have supported. We've supported about 100 people personally. We've walked them through this process. And what we have found is really incredible, because there's this way in which somebody's in prison, they think they're going to serve the rest of their life in prison, or they think they have 20 more years or 10 years to go, and they get this letter that says the DA is looking at your case. And then we work with them we want to understand their journey and like, what was their aha moment, and tell us about your statement of faith and how have you been maintaining a relationship with your daughter, and tell us those stories, and what's your vision and dream for yourself if you were given this extraordinary chance to come home, what would that look like? And what we have found is that combination with people who really they've done all this deep work around accountability, and they deeply understand the harm that they've caused. And the only real way for them to do anything with this sort of shame or guilt that they feel is to live a life of amends. Right. So they come home and all they want to do is be the best brother, be the best sibling, be the best neighbor. And there's this way that they're coming home. Sometimes we talk to them and we're like, you stop volunteering for things. Like, just too many things. Like, you're already working 2 jobs and you're taking care of your mom, and now you're volunteering at the homeless shelter. You're going to burn out. But they just have this fervor for giving back, because that's the only way that they can really forgive themselves for the harm that they've caused. And it's not everybody, it doesn't have to be everybody, but we see this a lot. And so you have folks coming home that, like I said, they're living a life of amends, and that's how they want to live the rest of their life, giving back. And they feel so much self-worth and purpose from doing things that are, either it's, we have one guy who's a substance abuse counselor, and the pride that he feels helping people with their addiction so they don't end up turning to crime and end up the way that he did, all the way to people who are plumbers. Mm-hmm. And Eric will tell us, it feels so good knowing that somebody was in chaos. They had a flood, and I went over there, and I'm leaving, and they're like, thank you so much. Like, I got to make their life easier. And I just think that we lose that a little bit when we talk about the mechanics and the legislation and the arguments and all of that. These are real people that
the human element.
They want nothing more than to like come home and like be a good neighbor.
I love what Hillary said about some of these people being released, but just wanting to be the best employee or best neighbor or best family once they're out. Because they've been in prison for so long, they aren't taking anything for granted. I'm going to admit I'm a bit torn about the idea of today's elected prosecutor unilaterally, albeit with the consent of a victim, shortening a sentence that a different DA or judge imposed years ago. But when I think about the millions of dollars we spend every year on incarcerating people, and the at least stated idea that rehabilitation is one of the reasons we send people to prison, I think it makes a lot of sense to at least give prosecutors the power, but not a mandate, to revisit old cases and release people when it's appropriate and safe to do so. If we have people who are not just fully rehabilitated but have great potential to contribute to our communities, and the victim is on board with the person being released early, why wouldn't we give that person a chance at freedom? Our communities are always in need of thoughtful and hardworking people. Their families would be better off being reunited. In my view, if the victim feels comfortable, I don't really see a downside. But here's the key big picture point I want to make. Regardless of how you feel about these laws, they are forcing prosecutors to rethink when their role in a case ends. At a minimum, I think it's interesting to explore the idea that the role of the prosecutor continues long after the judge hands down a sentence. I'd love to hear what you all think about this. Anyway, Hillary obviously gave us a ton to think about, and I'm grateful that she took the time to answer these tough questions. I hope you enjoy the conversation as much as I did. True Bill Talk is produced by Carrie Hayes from Coeo Strategies, Colin Nixon, and me, Alyssa Haydari. Many thanks to Hillary Blout for coming on the show and sharing so much about her personal background, resentencing laws, and how her views on the role of prosecutors has evolved over time. If you want to email me a question, have an idea for a future episode, or even want to just share your reaction to this episode, you can email me or drop a voice note at alyssa.haydari@vanderbilt.edu. You can also call 615-343-3826 and leave a voicemail. Thanks so much for listening, and go do justice.